The flight attendant stood at the front of the plane eyes, scanning the crowd as passengers boarded one by one. She was used to the usual first-class guests, polished suits, and perfect smiles. But today, something caught her eye: an elderly woman, walking slowly up the aisle with a large worn suitcase. Her clothes were old-fashioned, faded, and slightly wrinkled. A soft floral dress with a cardigan thrown over her shoulders. It wasn't a look that belonged in first class, not by a long shot. As the woman passed by, the flight attendant couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. The elderly lady didn't seem to notice or care for the stares from the other passengers. She moved with a quiet grace, her posture straight despite the obvious signs of age. The attendant couldn't stop herself from muttering under her breath, "First class." Really? She glanced over at her colleague, who was busy helping with the overhead compartments, and let out a quiet snicker. "Doesn't exactly scream luxury, does it?" Her colleague chuckled back, and the two of them shared a knowing look, a brief moment of mockery that no one else could hear, but to the flight attendant felt like a harmless little joke. The elderly woman had finally settled into her seat at the window. The aisle seat was still empty. The flight attendant couldn't help but keep an eye on her, curiosity creeping in. Was she really flying first class? Or was this a mistake, maybe a mix-up with the booking system? But there was something about her that didn't seem right, something that tugged at the flight attendant's attention. Every time she glanced her way, the woman's eyes were focused out the window, a deep sadness or wisdom behind them. It was almost as if she didn't care for the attention her presence drew. She was a figure of mystery, lost in her own world, surrounded by modern luxury, but somehow out of place, as though she didn't belong in this busy world of travelers and businessmen. As the flight began to fill and the attendants started their service routine, the flight attendant made her way to the elderly woman's seat once again. She couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was far more than she appeared at first glance. Approaching with a smile that she tried to make genuine, she asked, "Can I offer you a drink?" The woman looked up from her book and returned a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that made the flight attendant pause for a moment, just a moment of hesitation. It wasn't forced or awkward, it was real, like something in her eyes made her feel seen in a way that others usually couldn't. She leaned in a little too close to hand over the drink as she casually remarked, "You know your style, it's so classic. I haven't seen anyone wear clothes like that in ages." She tried to make the words sound light-hearted, but they slipped out with a bit of an edge-tone. She didn't even realize she had added her fingers, tapping the tray nervously. But the elderly woman simply smiled back. "It's a style that has always suited me," she said, her voice calm, soft, with a subtle knowing that made the flight attendant's smile falter. For a second, there was something about this woman's presence that disarmed her, made her feel small, as if all the assumptions she'd made in the last few minutes were suddenly meaningless. But the moment passed quickly, and she brushed it off, laughing quietly to herself. "Guess it's just not my style." But as the flight continued on, she couldn't stop thinking about her. Something about that quiet response lingered, and the more she tried to ignore it, the more it gnawed at her. There was an aura around the old woman, an unspoken history wrapped in those modest clothes, that the flight attendant had missed entirely. The elderly woman didn't seem to notice the whispers or the stares that followed her every move. It was as if she were in a world of her own, her eyes still fixed on the window, watching the clouds pass by, as if they held the answers to questions the flight attendant couldn't even imagine asking. She seemed content with the silence, but there was something in that silence that unnerved the attendant, like the quiet before a storm. Something was bound to break soon. It was only a matter of time. The flight attendant tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that had crept into her chest, but it lingered like a shadow following her every step. She continued with her duties, but every now and then her gaze would wander back to the elderly woman, who remained seated as calm as ever, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The old woman hadn't said much yet, but the flight attendant noticed how she carried herself with a kind of quiet dignity that demanded respect without ever asking for it. And the more she watched, the more she couldn't help but wonder how someone could exude so much peace in a world so full of noise. It wasn't long before the flight attendant found herself standing near the elderly woman again, this time offering snacks. She leaned in closer than usual, pretending to offer the woman a snack, but instead she whispered just low enough for her to hear, "You know, you'd look so much better in something more modern." The words came out before she could stop them, and as soon as they did, she regretted them immediately, but there was no going back now. The elderly woman didn't flinch, she didn't react at all, but there was something about the way she looked at the flight attendant in that moment that made her feel small and insignificant. The smile she gave was polite, but it wasn't warm, it was understanding, in a way that made the attendant wonder what the woman had seen in her lifetime. What had she experienced to be so composed, so unbothered by the petty comments that were tossed her way with little thought? The attendant cleared her throat and forced a smile, trying to brush off the tension she had created. "I mean, you have a certain charm to your look," she added quickly, but the old woman simply nodded without saying a word, as if she were choosing not to respond to the comment, or perhaps she had already heard it all before and knew better than to engage with something so shallow. The rest of the flight passed in a haze. The attendant couldn't focus on her tasks anymore. Her mind kept drifting back to the elderly woman and the calmness that seemed to radiate from her, the kind of calm that was almost unnerving. But the flight attendant couldn't figure out why she was so bothered by it. Was it because the woman seemed so at peace with herself, or was it because her own judgments felt so misplaced, so wrong? The deeper she thought about it, the more she realized how little she knew about this stranger sitting just a few seats away, how quickly she had judged someone based on their clothes, and how foolish it made her feel now. Every glance she took felt like a reminder of her own superficiality and her inability to see beyond the surface. She was just about to walk away again when the elderly woman's voice cut through her thoughts. "Sometimes we get so caught up in appearances, don't we?" The words were soft, but sharp enough to sting. The flight attendant turned to face her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't expected the woman to speak. She hadn't expected her to say anything at all. But there it was, the very thing the flight attendant had been avoiding, the very thing she had been feeling all along, and now the woman had said it out loud. And in that moment, the flight attendant couldn't help but wonder if the elderly lady had seen right through her. The flight attendant's heart raced as she walked away from the elderly woman, her mind replaying the soft words that had just been spoken. "Sometimes we get so caught up in appearances, don't we?" It echoed in her ears with every step. She took the words weren't just a casual remark. They were a challenge. They were a mirror held up to her own actions. And the more she tried to push them aside, the more they seemed to stay with her like a weight she couldn't shake. She busied herself with the rest of her duties, but it was hard to focus. The woman's face kept flashing in her mind, that calm, unbothered expression. The way she carried herself, like nothing in the world could affect her, no matter how much the flight attendant tried to dismiss it. There was something unnerving about her, something deeper than just old-fashioned clothes, something that made her feel out of place in the life she had carefully built around her own judgments and assumptions. As the flight began its steady cruise through the sky, the attendant took a deep breath and moved to the front of the cabin to check on a few things. It was supposed to be a quick, routine check. But as soon as she stepped near the cockpit, she saw the elderly woman again, her eyes still focused out the window. But now her gaze seemed different, almost distant, as if she were lost in some far-off memory. It was almost as if the flight attendant had been pulled into the woman's world without even realizing it. There was something magnetic about her, the way she carried herself. It was like a force of nature that made the flight attendant feel small. No matter how much she tried to maintain her composure, no matter how confident she was in her own position, the elderly woman had a power over her that she couldn't explain. and it unsettled her in a way she had never felt before. The attendant couldn't help herself. She found her feet moving toward the woman again this time. It wasn't for drink service or routine. It was something else, something that pulled her to that seat, as if she needed answers, as if the woman might hold the key to something she didn't know about herself. She approached the woman with a different energy this time, her usual sarcasm and judgment gone, replaced with an unease she couldn't shake. "Are you all right?" She asked, her voice softer than she intended. The elderly woman's eyes flicked toward her briefly before turning back to the window. The flight attendant could see that faint glimmer in those eyes again, like a secret the woman was holding on to, but she said nothing, just smiled gently and nodded, just thinking about the past. Her voice was slow and thoughtful, like she was reliving something in her mind. The words hung in the air between them for a moment before the attendant spoke again, her curiosity now fully piqued the past. She repeated, feeling the weight of the question before she even asked it. The elderly woman turned her head just slightly enough to meet the attendant's gaze, her smile still there, but now it was tinged with something else, a kind of knowing sadness. "The past always has a way of catching up with us, doesn't it?" she said softly, as though she were speaking to herself. More than to the flight attendant, her words were quiet, but carried a depth that made the air around them feel heavier. The flight attendant's throat tightened. She wasn't sure why, but she felt like she had just crossed some invisible line, a line that separated the world she knew from a world she didn't understand yet. And as much as she wanted to retreat, she found herself standing still, staring at the woman's face, wondering what memories lay behind those eyes, what story she was holding back. But the moment passed quickly as the elderly woman returned her attention to the window once again, her face a mask of calm, and the attendant stood there for a moment longer, unsure whether to say anything else, unsure whether she was even welcome to know more. But the answer she was looking for remained just out of reach, like a mystery that refused to be solved. The flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The words the elderly woman had spoken kept swirling in her mind. "The past always has a way of catching up with us, doesn't it?" There was an undeniable weight to them, something more than just a casual observation. It was as if the woman was trying to tell her something. But what could she possibly mean? Why had she said it like that, like she was holding back a secret too important to share? The rest of the flight felt like a blur for the flight attendant. She couldn't focus on anything. Every time she passed the elderly woman's seat, she would steal a glance, only to find the woman still staring out the window, her expression unreadable, her face an enigma that the flight attendant couldn't crack. It was like she was looking at something only the old woman could see, something far beyond the confines of this cramped airplane. But what was it? What was she thinking about with such intensity? It was when they began their descent that the attendant found herself near the elderly woman's seat. Once again, this time the words that had been left unsaid between them seemed heavier. The silence stretched between them like a thin veil, just waiting to be broken. The attendant couldn't resist. She had to ask more. She had to know what was behind those words. "You said the past catches up with us." She began, her voice softer this time. "What do you mean by that?" The woman's eyes didn't leave the window as she spoke, but her voice was calm as ever. "It's a strange thing, the past. It's never really gone. No matter how far we run from it, it always comes back when we least expect it." The flight attendant felt the hair on the back of her neck rise. The way the woman said it was almost as if she were speaking from experience, as if she had lived through something that the attendant couldn't even begin to understand. The attendant couldn't help herself. Her curiosity was burning now. She had to know more. "Has your past come back?" she asked before she could stop herself. But the moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. She knew she was prying too much too soon. But the elderly woman didn't seem offended. She just looked at her with that same knowing smile. "Maybe it has," she said softly, her words almost a whisper. "Maybe it hasn't. And just like that, the mystery deepened. The flight attendant felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Something about the way the woman spoke made her feel like she was on the verge of learning something monumental, something that could change everything. But the woman wasn't giving her the answers she craved. She wasn't offering up any details, just more questions and more uncertainty. The descent continued, and the plane began to shake slightly as it entered the turbulent air. The flight attendant's mind raced, but she kept her composure, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. She couldn't afford to get lost in this mystery, not when there were passengers to look after. But as she moved down the aisle, she couldn't help but glance back at the elderly woman once more. This time their eyes met for just a second, and for the first time the flight attendant saw something flash. In the woman's eyes, a flicker of recognition. Or maybe it was something else. But whatever it was, it sent a chill down her spine. The plane finally landed with a jolt, and the flight attendant felt her heart pounding in her chest as the passengers began to gather their things. But before she could turn to leave, the elderly woman's voice stopped her one last time. "Sometimes the truth is hidden in plain sight," she said, her voice quiet but deliberate. "You just have to know where to look." And with that, the woman turned and began to gather her belongings, as if nothing had happened, as if their entire conversation had been nothing more than a passing breeze. But the flight attendant knew better. She knew that the woman had just dropped a bombshell, and now she couldn't escape the truth that was out there waiting to be uncovered, waiting for her to finally understand. The flight attendant couldn't get the woman's last words out of her mind. Sometimes the truth is hidden in plain sight. You just have to know where to look. It was as if a switch had been flipped inside her mind, and now every part of her was focused on that one sentence. It felt like the key to something important. But what could she possibly be talking about? How could the truth be hiding in plain sight? And why had the woman said it like that, like she knew something that could change everything? After the plane had landed and the passengers began to disembark, the flight attendant felt a strange pull to go back to the elderly woman's seat. But she knew she couldn't. She had to let her go. They both had their separate lives to lead. But no matter how hard she tried to shake it off, something kept tugging at her heart, making her feel like she couldn't walk away, not yet, not without knowing more. She made her way to the galley to prepare for the return flight, and though she tried to focus on the tasks at hand, her mind kept drifting back to the woman, to those cryptic words that felt like they held the answer to a question she hadn't even realized she was asking. It was driving her mad. How could she be so focused on a stranger, someone she would never see again after today? But it wasn't just about the woman. It was about the feeling that something had changed. Something was different now. Something had shifted inside her, like a door had opened that she hadn't even known was there. And the more she tried to close it, the more it seemed to pull her back in. Just as she was about to walk away from the galley, she felt a tap on her shoulder. It was one of the other attendants. His face was flushed with excitement and a bit of disbelief. "You won't believe this," he said under his breath, his eyes darting toward the back of the plane. The flight attendant raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" she asked, trying to mask the sudden surge of curiosity that rushed through her. He motioned for her to follow him, and they slipped through the cabin to the rear of the plane. As they moved closer, the flight attendant could feel her heart start to race. What was going on? Why was he acting so strange? When they reached the back, he stopped and pointed to the elderly woman's seat. She was gone. The seat was empty, and the flight attendant felt her stomach drop like a weight had been lifted, but not in the way she expected. It wasn't relief. It was confusion, unease. Something was wrong. "Where did she go?" the flight attendant asked, but her colleague just shook his head. "I don't know. I was walking through the cabin, and when I came back, she was gone. No one saw her leave," he said, his voice quiet, like he didn't want anyone else to hear. But the flight attendant didn't care about being discreet. All she could think was, why had the woman disappeared without a trace? It was as if she had vanished into thin air. She felt her breath catch in her throat. The woman had told her something important. The truth was hidden in plain sight. But now she was gone, and the mystery felt more real than ever. The flight attendant stood there frozen for a moment, her mind spinning with questions and fears. What had just happened? Had she imagined everything? Was she being paranoid? Or was there something far deeper at play here, something she wasn't seeing yet? Just then she noticed something on the seat. It was a small envelope, carefully placed right where the woman had been sitting. She reached out and picked it up, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside was a single card with a name and a number written in elegant handwriting. She read the name aloud to herself, Claire Jenkins. And the number underneath it felt like a punch to the stomach. As she stared at it, she knew, without a doubt, this wasn't just some coincidence. This was the beginning of something far bigger than she could have ever imagined. The flight attendant stood frozen, her fingers still wrapped around the envelope. The name Claire Jenkins burned into her mind. Like a brand, she couldn't tear her eyes away from it. What did it mean? Why was it there? Why had the elderly woman left it behind? She could feel her heartbeat quicken with every passing second. The air around her suddenly felt heavy, the kind of silence that fills a room right before something major happens, something big. She had to know more. But where could she start? How could she even begin to unravel what felt like a tangled mess of secrets? She glanced up at her colleague, who was watching her with a raised eyebrow. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, but there was a hint of concern in it. The flight attendant didn't answer right away. Instead, she stuffed the envelope into her pocket and turned toward the front of the plane. "I'll be fine," she muttered, more to herself than to him. But even as she walked away, she felt the weight of the card pressing against her side, a reminder that something had changed, that she wasn't going to be able to just forget this. As she moved through the aisles and out of the galley, she found herself staring at the empty seat where the elderly woman had been moments before. It was as if she had never even existed. The seat was clean, the tray table locked in place, nothing out of the ordinary. But everything had changed. There was no way she could walk away from this. She couldn't let it go. She needed answers. The flight attendant went back to her duties, but she couldn't focus. She couldn't think about anything other than the card, the woman, the mystery that was unfolding right in front of her eyes. She had to know who Claire Jenkins was. Why had the woman left the card? And why had she vanished without a trace? It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. Yet the feeling in her gut told her this was important, this was real, and it wasn't something she could just ignore. When the plane finally touched down at the airport, the flight attendant didn't wait around. She couldn't wait. She knew she had to find out who Claire Jenkins was, and the first step was to call the number on the card. As soon as the passengers were disembarking, she slipped into the back hallway and pulled out her phone. Her fingers shook as she dialed the number, and as the phone rang, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen. If the call was answered, what would she learn? What was waiting for her on the other side of that line? The phone rang 3 times before a voice picked up. "Hello." The voice was soft, but clear, almost too calm. The flight attendant's heart skipped a beat. She had expected some sort of voicemail or automated message. But this was real. This was someone answering. "Is this Claire Jenkins?" The flight attendant asked, her voice suddenly shaky. She didn't know why she was so nervous. She had no reason to be, but there was something about this whole situation that made her feel like she was walking a fine line between curiosity and danger. There was a pause on the other end, and then the voice responded, "Yes, this is Claire Jenkins." The words sent a chill through the flight attendant's spine. She felt like she had just stepped into a world she wasn't prepared for, a world where nothing was as it seemed. "How can I help you?" Claire's voice was polite but distant, like she was waiting for something, like she knew exactly why the flight attendant was calling, but the question was how. The flight attendant swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. I don't know if you remember, but I was on the flight today. I met someone, a woman. She left me something, a card with your name and number." Her words were rushed, like they didn't want to be spoken. But the woman on the other end didn't interrupt. She simply listened. "Who is she?" The flight attendant asked, her voice almost a whisper now, as she waited for the answer that she hoped would unlock everything, but also the one that terrified her the most. There was a long silence, and then Claire's voice came back. It was softer now, almost sad. "You met her, didn't you? You met my mother." The words hung in the air, like a weight that couldn't be lifted. The words felt like a blow to the chest. "My mother." The flight attendant repeated the words in her mind. But they didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. Everything about this situation was starting to unravel in ways she couldn't even begin to understand. She had been so sure the elderly woman was just a stranger, someone she had judged too quickly, someone who had shown her a glimpse of something deeper. But now this new information had shattered everything. Claire's mother. What was that supposed to mean? Why hadn't she said anything? Why had she vanished like that? Her fingers tightened around the phone as she tried to keep her voice steady. "Your mother." She managed to whisper the words, feeling strange on her tongue. But why didn't she say anything? Why leave me the card? The silence on the other end felt like a weight pressing down on her. She could hear Claire breathing. But there was something in the air, something unsaid, something that was waiting to come out. "She wanted you to find out." Claire's voice finally broke through the tension. But it was quiet, distant, as if it had been weighed down by years of untold stories. The flight attendant's mind raced as she thought about the elderly woman again, her face, the calm in her eyes, the way she seemed to know everything, but said nothing. The flight attendant didn't know what to believe anymore. Nothing seemed real. Her whole world had shifted with one phone call, one simple revelation. She had to know more. She couldn't just stop now. Not when it felt like she was so close to something important. "I don't understand." The flight attendant said, the words coming out in a rush, her thoughts colliding with each other in a chaotic mess. "Why didn't she talk to me? Why leave me that card? Why not just tell me who she was?" Her breath came in short bursts, her head spinning, but Claire's response was steady, measured. "She couldn't tell you, not yet. She needed you to find the truth for yourself." The words sounded cryptic, but there was something in them that made the flight attendant pause. It felt like a riddle, a puzzle she had to solve. But how could she solve it when she didn't even know where to start? Who was she really? The flight attendant asked the question, now almost begging for an answer. But Claire's voice was softer now, more fragile, as if the truth she was about to reveal would shatter something even more delicate. "My mother wasn't always who you think she was. She had a past, that she left behind, a past that she wanted to keep buried." The flight attendant felt a cold chill wash over her as she listened. Claire continued, "She came from a different life, a life that no one knew about, not even me. She didn't want anyone to know the truth. She didn't want you to know. But she couldn't keep running forever." The flight attendant's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what to think or what to feel. It was as if she had stumbled into a hidden world, a world where nothing was what it seemed, and she had been caught in the middle of it all. But Claire wasn't finished yet. "The woman you met on the plane wasn't just my mother. She was someone else too, someone who had been part of something much bigger than you could imagine." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and the flight attendant's mind struggled to keep up. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, her breath coming faster now as the weight of Claire's words hit her. "I can't explain it all right now, but you need to understand something." Claire's voice grew firmer. "The truth is out there, and you're the only one who can find it. You need to look closely. You need to ask the right questions. But be careful, because some truths are too dangerous to uncover." The warning in Claire's voice made the flight attendant's blood run cold, and for the first time since this whole ordeal started, she felt truly scared. The phone call ended abruptly with Claire's final words echoing in the silence. "Don't trust everything you see." And just like that, the flight attendant was left alone with more questions than she could handle. The weight of the conversation felt like a crushing pressure as she sat there in the empty hallway of the airport, her mind spinning with thoughts of the elderly woman, Claire's mother, and the dangerous path that now lay ahead of her. But she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't turn back now. The mystery had been set in motion, and there was no stopping it. The flight attendant's hand trembled as she put the phone down. Her mind was racing. The words Claire had said echoed in her mind. Don't trust everything you see. The warning felt like a shadow that had just fallen over her. She felt exposed, like she was walking into a storm without any protection. What was the truth? What was real? She had no answers, just a storm of confusion and fear swirling inside her. But she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't just walk away from this. She had already come too far. The feeling of being watched lingered in the air, like a cold breath against her neck. She tried to shake it off, but it clung to her like a second skin. She glanced around the empty hallway, but it was quiet, too quiet. She had always felt safe here, surrounded by familiar faces and routines. But now everything had shifted. The world felt unfamiliar. The silence felt dangerous. She turned back toward the terminal, her heart pounding in her chest as she walked through the bustling airport. But even among the crowd, she couldn't escape the unease that followed her. It was as if something was just out of reach, something hidden from view, just beyond the edges of her awareness. She glanced over her shoulder again. But there was no one there, no sign of the mysterious woman or Claire, only the usual passengers making their way to their gates. But the feeling wouldn't go away. The flight attendant needed answers. She needed to understand what had happened, what was really going on. She couldn't keep going through this blind, not knowing who to trust or what to believe. She had to start asking the right questions. But where could she even begin? As the hours passed, she sat in the airport cafe, trying to collect her thoughts. Her mind was a blur as she sipped on a cup of coffee. But she couldn't focus. The woman's face, the words Claire had spoken, everything was spinning out of control. She stared at the envelope in her pocket, the one the elderly woman had left behind, the one that had started all of this. But even now she wasn't sure what it meant. Who was Claire's mother? Really, what had she been a part of? Why had she disappeared so suddenly? Then, out of nowhere, she felt a hand on her shoulder. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned quickly and found herself face to face with a man she hadn't seen before. He was tall, with dark hair and a serious expression. His eyes were piercing, like he was studying her every move. And before she could react, he spoke, his voice low and calm. "You've been looking for answers, haven't you?" He said, his words laced with something that sent a shiver down her spine. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure what to do, unsure what was going on. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaky, her instincts telling her to get up and run. But the man didn't seem threatening. He just stood there watching her with that unreadable look on his face. "Someone who knows the truth," he said simply, and the words sent another chill down her spine. "The truth about what?" she asked, her voice trembling now. "The truth about the woman you met," he said, his gaze never leaving hers, "and the danger she's brought into your life." The flight attendant felt a knot tighten in her stomach, her thoughts spiraling as she tried to piece everything together. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for, the moment where everything was supposed to make sense. But nothing felt clear. Instead, her fear grew. The more she learned, the more questions she had. "What do you mean, danger?" she whispered. But before the man could answer, she heard a soft voice behind her. "Leave her alone." The voice was familiar. It was Claire's voice. And just like that, the tension exploded into chaos. The man turned quickly, his eyes narrowing, as Claire appeared out of nowhere, standing between the flight attendant and him. "You shouldn't have come," Claire said, her voice sharp with authority. The man seemed to hesitate for just a second, but then he backed away slowly, his expression darkening. "You're not ready for this," he said before turning and walking away into the crowd. The flight attendant felt her heart race as Claire turned to face her. She wanted to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she could only stare at Claire, who now looked more serious than ever. "You have no idea what you've just stepped into," Claire said, her voice heavy with warning. "But I'll tell you this much: you're in it now, and there's no turning back."